other bunks were all empty. His neighbours must have been transferred to another cell, or else they were being interrogated. He lay there, frayed. He was quite lost. His whole life had been smeared with filth. He had a terrible pain in the small of his back. They must have injured his kidneys. At this bitter moment his whole life shattered. He understood the power of a woman's love, a wife. No one else could love a man who'd been trampled on by iron feet. She'd wash his feet after he'd been spat on. She'd comb his tangled hair. She'd look into his embittered eyes. The more they lacerated his soul, the more revolting and contemptible he became to the world, the more she would love him. She'd run after a truck. She'd wait in the queues on Kuznetsky Most, or even by the camp boundary fence, desperate to hand over a few sweets or an onion. She'd bake shortbread for him on an oil stove. She'd give whole years of her life just to be able to see him for half an hour. Not every woman you sleep with can be called a wife. The despair that cut into him like a knife made him want to reduce someone else to despair. He composed several lines of a letter to her. Doubtless you were glad to hear what has happened, not because I've been crushed, but because you managed to run away from me in time. You must be blessing your rat's instinct that made you desert a sinking ship. I am alone. He glimpsed the telephone on the investigator's desk. A great lout was punching him in the side, under his ribs. The captain was raising the blind, turning out the light. He could hear the rustling of the pages of his file. He was just falling asleep with that sound in his ears when someone drove a crooked, red-hot cobbler's awl into his skull. His brain seemed to smell of burning. Yevgenia Nikolaevna had denounced him. Marble. Pure marble. The words spoken to him one morning in the Znamenka, in the office of the chairman of the Revolutionary War Soviet of the Republic. The man with the pointed beard and sparkling pince-nez had read through Krymov's article and talked to him in a quiet, friendly voice. He remembered it all. That night he had told Xenia how the Central Committee had recalled him from the Comintern in order to edit booklets for Politizat. Once he was a human being, he had said of Trotsky, as he described how the latter had read his article, Revolution and Reform, China and India. How he had said, "That's pure marble." These words had been spoken tête-à-tête, and he had never repeated them to anyone except Xenia. The investigator must have heard them from her lips. She had denounced him. He no longer felt his 70 hours without sleep. He was already quite recovered. Perhaps she had been coerced. What if she had? Comrades Mikhail Sidorovich Mostovskoy, I am dead. I've been killed. Not by a bullet from a pistol, not by someone's fist, not even by being deprived of sleep. Xenia has killed me. I'll testify and confess to anything, but on one condition. You must confirm that it was she who denounced me. He got out of bed and started to bang on the door with his fist. The sentry immediately looked in through the spy-hole, and Krymov shouted, "Take me to the investigator. I'll sign everything." The duty officer appeared and said, "Stop that noise. You can give your testimony when you're called." He couldn't just stay here alone. It was easier to be beaten up and lose consciousness. That was much better, and thanks to medical science. He hobbled to his bed. Just as it seemed he was unable to endure another moment of this torment, just as his brain seemed on the point of bursting open and sending out thousands of splinters into his heart, throat and eyes, he understood. It was quite impossible that Zenetchka had denounced him. He coughed and began to shake. Forgive me. I wasn't destined to be happy with you. That's my fault, not yours." He was gripped by a wonderful feeling, the kind of feeling that had probably never been experienced by anyone in this building since Terzinski had first set foot in it. He woke up. Opposite him sat the vast bulk of Katzenellenbogen, crowned by his mop of dishevelled curls. Krymov smiled, and a frown appeared on his neighbour's low, fleshy forehead. Krymov understood that Katzenellenbogen had seen his smile as a symptom of madness. I see they gave you a hard time, said Katzenellenbogen, pointing at Krimov's blood-stained shirt. They did, Krimov grimaced. And what about you? I was having a rest in hospital. Our neighbours have left. The Special Commission has given drilling another 10 years, which makes 30 in all. And Bogoleyev's been transferred to another cell. Go on, say what you want to say. I think that under communism the MGB will secretly gather together everything good about people, every kind of word they ever say. Their agents will listen in on telephone calls, read through letters, get people to speak their minds, but only in order to elicit everything to do with faithfulness, honesty and kindness. All this will be reported to the Lubyanka and gathered into a dossier, but only good things. This will be a place where faith in humanity is strengthened, not where it is destroyed. I've already laid the first stone, I believe. Yes, I have conquered in spite of every denunciation and lie. I believe. I believe. Katzenellenbogen listened to him absent-mindedly. That's very true. That's how it will be. All you need add is that once this radiant dossier has been gathered together, you'll be brought here, to the big house, and beaten up the same as always. He looked searchingly at Krimov. He couldn't understand how a man with Krimov's yellow, sallow face, a man with hollow, sunken eyes and clots of black blood on his chin, could possibly be smiling so calmly and happily. Paulus's adjutant, Colonel Adam, was standing in front of an open suitcase. His Batman, Ritter, was squatting on the floor and sorting through piles of underwear that had been spread out on newspapers. They had spent the night burning papers in the Field Marshal's office. They had even burnt Paulus's own large map, something Adam looked on as a sacred relic of the war. Paulus hadn't slept at all that night. He had refused his morning coffee and had watched Adam's comings and goings with complete indifference. From time to time he got up and walked about the room, picking his way through the files of papers awaiting cremation. The canvas-backed maps proved hard to burn. They choked up the grate and had to be cleared out with a poker. Each time Ritter opened the door of the stove, Paulus stretched out his hands to the fire. Adam had thrown a greatcoat over Paulus's shoulders, but he had shaken it off irritably. Adam had had to hang it up again on the peg. Did Paulus imagine he was already in Siberia, warming his hands at the fire, together with all the other soldiers? Wilderness ahead of him, wilderness behind. I ordered Ritter to put plenty of warm underclothes in your suitcase, said Adam. When we were children and we tried to imagine the Last Judgment, we were wrong. It's got nothing to do with fire and blazing coals. General Schmidt had called round twice during the night. The cables had all been cut and the telephones had fallen silent. From the moment they had first been encircled, Paulus had seen very clearly that his forces would be unable to fight. All the conditions, tactical, psychological, meteorological and technical, that had determined his success during the summer were now absent. The pluses had turned into minuses. He had reported to Hitler that in his opinion the Sixth Army should break through the encircling forces to the southwest in liaison with Manstein and form a corridor for the evacuation of the troops. They'd have to reconcile themselves to the loss of a large part of their heavy armaments. On 24th of December, Yeremenko had defeated Manstein's forces near the Mishkovka River. From that moment it had been obvious to anyone that further resistance in Stalingrad was impossible. Only one man had disputed this. He had begun referring to the Sixth Army as the advance post of a front that stretched from the White Sea to the Terek. He had renamed it Fortress Stalingrad. Meanwhile, the staff at Army headquarters had begun referring to it as a camp for armed prisoners of war. Paulus had sent another coded message to the effect that there was still some possibility of a breakout. He had expected a terrible outburst of fury. No one had ever dared contradict the Supreme Commander twice. He had heard the story of how Hitler, in a rage, had once torn the Knight's Cross from Field Marshal Rundstedt's chest. Brauchtisch, who had witnessed this scene, had apparently had a heart attack. The Führer was not someone to trifle with. On the 31st of January, Paulus had finally received an answer, the announcement of his promotion to the rank of Field Marshal. He had made one more attempt to prove his point, and had been awarded with the highest decoration of the Reich, the Knight's Cross, with oak leaves. It gradually dawned on him that Hitler was treating him as a dead man. It had been a posthumous promotion, a posthumous award of the Knight's Cross. His existence now served only one purpose, to create a heroic image of the defender of Stalingrad. The official propaganda had made saints and martyrs of the hundreds of thousands of men under his command. They were alive, boiling their horse meat, hunting down the last Stalingrad dogs, catching magpies in the steppes, crushing lice, smoking cigarettes made from nothing but twists of paper. Meanwhile, the state radio stations played solemn funeral music in honour of those still living heroes. They were alive, blowing on their red fingers, wiping the snot from their noses, thinking about the chances of stealing something to eat, shamming illness, surrendering to the enemy, or warming themselves on a Russian woman in a cellar. Meanwhile, over the airwaves, choirs of little boys and girls were singing. They died so that Germany could live. Only if the state should perish could these men be reborn to the sins and wonders of everyday life. Everything had happened precisely as Paulus had predicted. This sense of his own rightness, confirmed by the absolute destruction of his army, was painful to live with. At the same time, in spite of himself, it gave him a kind of tired satisfaction, a reinforced sense of his own worth. Thoughts he had suppressed during his days of glory now came back to him. Keitel and Jodl had called Hitler the Divine Führer. Goebbels had declared that Hitler's tragedy was that the war offered him no opponent worthy of his own genius. Zeitzler, on the other hand, had told him how Hitler had once asked him to straighten the line of the front, on the grounds that its curves offended his aesthetic sensibilities. And what about his mad, neurotic refusal to advance on Moscow, and the sudden failure of will that had led him to call a halt to the advance on Leningrad? It was only a fear of losing face that made him insist so fanatically on the defence of Stalingrad. And now everything was as clear as daylight. But clarity can be very terrifying. He could have refused to obey the order. Hitler would have had him executed, but he would have saved the lives of his men. Yes, he had seen many people look at him with reproach. He could have saved his army. But he was afraid of Hitler, afraid for his own skin. Schaub, the chief of the SD at headquarters, had flown to Berlin the other day. He had made some confused remark to the effect that the Führer had revealed himself to be too great even for the German people. Yes, of course. Demagogy. Nothing but demagogy. Adam turned on the radio. The initial crackle of interference was succeeded by music. Germany was lamenting the dead of Stalingrad. The music had a strange power. Maybe the myth created by the Führer would mean more for the people and for battles to come than the lives of the lice-ridden, frost-bitten wrecks that had once been his men. Maybe the Führer's logic was not a logic that could be understood merely from reading orders, poring over maps, and drawing up schedules. Perhaps the aura of martyrdom to which Hitler had condemned the Sixth Army would bestow a new existence on Paulus and his soldiers, allowing them to participate in the future of Germany. It wasn't a matter of pencils, calculating machines, and slide rules. This quartermaster general worked according to a different logic, different criteria. Adam, dear faithful Adam, the purest souls are constantly and inevitably a prey to doubt. The world is always dominated by limited men, men with an unshakable conviction of their own rightness. The purest souls never take great decisions, or hold sway over states. "They're coming!" shouted Adam. He ordered Ritter to put the open suitcase out of the way and then straightened his uniform. There were holes in the heels of the socks Ritter had just thrown into the case. What troubled Ritter was not that a careless and anxious Paulus might wear these socks, but that the holes might be glimpsed by hostile Russian eyes. Adam adopted what he considered to be the correct pose for an adjutant to a field marshal. He stood quite still, his hands resting on the back of a chair, his back turned to the door that any moment now would be flung open, his eyes gazing calmly, attentively, and affectionately at Paulus himself. Paulus leant back away from the table, compressing his lips. If the Führer wanted play-acting, then he was ready to comply. Any minute now the door would open. This room in a dark cellar would be scrutinized by men who lived on the earth's surface. The pain and bitterness had passed. What remained was fear that the door would be opened, not by the representatives of the Soviet High Command, who had prepared their role in this solemn scene, but by wild, trigger-happy soldiers. And fear of the unknown. Once this final scene had been played out, life would begin again. But what kind of life? And where? Siberia? A Moscow prison? A barrack hut in a labour camp? That night the people on the left bank had seen multicoloured flares light up the sky over Stalingrad. The German army had surrendered. People had immediately begun crossing the Volga into the city itself. They had heard that the remaining inhabitants of Stalingrad had endured terrible hunger during these last weeks. The officers, soldiers and sailors from the Volga fleet all carried little bundles of tinned food and loaves of bread. A few of them also brought some vodka or an accordion. These unarmed soldiers who entered Stalingrad during the night, who handed out bread and kissed and embraced the inhabitants, seemed almost sad. There was little singing or rejoicing. The morning of the 2nd of February 1943 was very misty. The mist rose up from the holes pierced in the ice and from the few patches of unfrozen water. The sun rose, as harsh now in the winter winds as during the blazing heat of August. The dry snow drifted about over the level ground, forming milky spirals and columns, then suddenly lost its will and settled again. Everywhere you could see traces of the east wind, collars of snow round the stems of thorn bushes, congealed ripples on the slopes of the gullies, small mounds and patches of bare clay. From the Stalingrad bank it looked as though the people crossing the Volga were formed out of the mist itself, as though they had been sculpted by the wind and frost. They had no mission to accomplish in Stalingrad. The war here was over, and no one had sent them. They came spontaneously, of their own accord, soldiers and road layers, drivers and gunners, army tailors, mechanics and electricians. Together with old men wrapped in shawls, old women wearing soldiers' trousers, and little boys and girls dragging sledges laden with bundles and blankets, they crossed the Volga and scrambled up the slopes of the right bank. Something very strange had happened to the city. You could hear the sound of car horns and tractor engines. People were playing harmonicas. Soldiers were shouting and laughing. Dancers were stamping down the snow with their felt boots. But for all this, the city felt dead. The normal life of Stalingrad had come to an end several months before. Schools, factories, women's dressmakers, amateur choirs, theatre groups, creches, cinemas, the city police had all ceased to function. A new city, wartime Stalingrad, had been born out of the flames. This city had its own layout of streets and squares, its own underground buildings, its own traffic laws, its own commerce, factories and artisans, its own cemeteries, concerts and drinking parties. Every epoch has its own capital city, a city that embodies its will and soul. For several months of the Second World War this city was Stalingrad. The thoughts and passions of humanity were centred on Stalingrad. Factories and printing presses functioned for the sake of Stalingrad. Parliamentary leaders rose to their feet to speak of Stalingrad. But when thousands of people poured in from the steppes to fill the empty streets, when the first car engine started up, this world capital ceased to exist. On that day, newspapers all over the world reported the details of the German surrender. People in Europe, America and India were able to read how Field Marshal Paulus had left his underground headquarters, how the German generals had undergone a preliminary interrogation at the headquarters of Shumilov's 64th Army, and about what General Schmidt, Paulus's chief of staff, had been wearing. By then, Hitler, Roosevelt and Churchill were looking for new crisis points in the war. Stalin was tapping the table with his finger and asking the chief of the general staff if arrangements had been completed to transfer the troops from Stalingrad to other fronts. The capital of the World War, full as it was of generals, experts in street fighting, strategic maps, armaments, and well-kept communication trenches, had ceased to exist. Or rather, it had begun a new existence, similar to that of present-day Athens or Rome. Historians, museum guides, teachers, and eternally bored schoolchildren, though not yet visible, had become its new masters. At the same time, an everyday working city was coming into being, with schools, factories, maternity homes, police, an opera, and a prison. A light dusting of snow had fallen on the paths along which men had carried shells, loaves of bread, and pots of kasha to gun emplacements, along which they had dragged machine guns, along which snipers and artillery observers had crept to their stone hiding places. Snow had fallen on the paths along which messengers had run between companies and battalions, the paths leading from Batyuk's division to Bani Ovrag, to the slaughterhouse and the water towers. Snow had fallen on the paths where the inhabitants of the wartime city had gone for a smoke, to celebrate a comrade's name day with a few drinks, to have a wash in a cellar, to play a game of dominoes, to have a taste of a neighbour's sauerkraut. Snow had fallen on the paths leading to dear Manya and the beautiful Vera, to menders of watches and cigarette lighters, to tailors, accordion players and storekeepers. A whole network of capricious winding paths was being covered by snow. Not one fresh footprint could be seen on all these thousands of kilometres. This first snowfall was soon followed by a second. The paths blurred and faded. Meanwhile, thousands of people were making new paths, ordinary paths, that didn't wind about in great loops or hug the walls of ruins. The old inhabitants of the city felt both happy and empty. After defending Stalingrad for so long, the soldiers felt strangely depressed. The whole city was suddenly empty, and everyone could feel it, from army commanders and commanders of infantry divisions to ordinary soldiers like Polyakov and Glushkov. This feeling was absurd. Why should a victorious end to the slaughter make one feel sad? The telephone on the commanding officer's desk was silent in its yellow case. A collar of snow had settled round the housing of the machine gun. Battery commanders' telescopes and embrasures had clouded over. Well-thumbed maps and plans were transferred from map cases to pouches, and sometimes to kit bags and suitcases of commanders of platoons, companies and battalions. At the same time, crowds of people were wandering among the dead houses, shouting loud hoorays and embracing one another. They looked at each other and thought, "What fine, brave lads you are, just like us in your winter hats and your jackets, but what we've achieved doesn't even bear thinking about. We've lifted the heaviest burden in the world. We've raised up truth over lies. We've just accomplished what most people only read of in fairy tales." All of these people belonged to the same city. Some of them came from Kuporosnaya, Balka, others from Bani Ovrag, others from the water towers or from Red October, still others from Mamayev Kurgan. And the people who had lived in the centre, on the banks of the Tsaritsa, near the wharves, behind the oil tanks, came out to meet them. The soldiers were both hosts and guests. The wind roared as they showered one another with congratulations. From time to time they fired a few shots in the air or let off a hand grenade. They clapped each other on the back, threw their arms round each other, kissed with cold lips, and then broke into light-hearted curses. They had all risen up from under the earth. Metal workers, turners, ploughmen, carpenters, navvies. They had ploughed up stone, iron and clay. Together they had fought off the enemy. A world capital is unique, not only because it's linked with the fields and factories of the whole world. A world capital is unique because it has a soul. The soul of wartime Stalingrad was freedom. The capital of the war against the fascists was now no more than the icy ruins of what had once been a provincial industrial city and port. Here, 10 years later, was constructed a vast dam, one of the largest hydroelectric power stations in the world, the product of the forced labour of thousands of prisoners. The German officer had only just woken up and hadn't yet heard the news of the surrender. He had fired a shot at Sergeant Zadnier Pruk and slightly wounded him. This had aroused the wrath of the Russians in charge of the operation. The German soldiers were filing out of their vast bunkers and throwing down their arms with a loud clatter onto the steadily growing pile of Tommy guns and rifles. The prisoners tried to look straight ahead, as a sign that even their gaze was now captive. Private Schmidt was the only exception. He had smiled as he came out into the daylight, and then looked up and down the Russian ranks as though he was sure of glimpsing a familiar face. Colonel Filimonov, who was slightly drunk after arriving from Moscow the day before, was standing beside his interpreter and watching General Wegeler's divisions surrender their arms. His greatcoat, with its new gold epaulets, its red tabs and black edging, stood out among the filthy, scorched jackets and crumpled caps of the Russian officers and the equally filthy, scorched, crumpled clothes of the German prisoners. He had said yesterday in the military Soviet canteen that the Central Commissariat in Moscow still contained supplies of gold braid that had been used for epaulets in pre-revolutionary days. It was a done thing among his circle of friends to have one's epaulets sewn from this fine old braid. When he heard the shot and Zadniapruk's wounded cry, Filimov shouted, "What was that? Who's shooting?" "Some fool of a German," several officers answered. "They're bringing him in along. He says he didn't know." "Didn't know?" shouted Filimonov. "Hasn't the swine spilt enough of our blood?" He turned to his interpreter, a tall Jewish political instructor. "Bring me that officer straight away. I'll make him pay for that shot with his life." Just then Filimonov caught sight of Schmidt's large smiling face and shouted, "So it makes you laugh, does it, to know that another of our men's been crippled? I'll teach you, you swine." Schmidt was unable to understand why his well-meaning smile should have made this Russian officer scream at him with such fury. Then he heard a pistol shot, seeming quite unconnected with these shouts. No longer understanding anything at all, he stumbled and fell beneath the feet of the soldiers behind. His body was dragged out of the way. It lay there on one side while the other soldiers marched past. After that, a group of young boys, who were certainly not afraid of a mere corpse, climbed down into the bunkers and began probing about under the plank beds. Colonel Filimonov, meanwhile, was inspecting the battalion commander's underground quarters and admiring their comfort and solidity. A soldier brought in a young German officer with calm, clear eyes. "Comrade Colonel," said the interpreter, "this is the man you asked to have brought to you, Lieutenant Lenard." "This one?" asked Filimov, in surprise. He liked the look of the officer's face. He was upset at having been involved, for the first time in his life, in a murder. "Oh, take him to the assembly point, and no mucking about. I want him alive. I shall hold you responsible." The day of judgment was drawing to an end. It was already impossible to make out the smile on the face of the dead soldier. Lieutenant Colonel Mikhailov, the chief interpreter of the 7th Section of the political administration of the front, was accompanying Field Marshal Paulus to the headquarters of the 64th Army. Paulus had left his cellar without so much as glancing at the Soviet officers and soldiers. They had stared at him with greedy curiosity. admiring his grey rabbit fur hat and his field marshal's greatcoat with its band of green leather running from the shoulder to the waist. He had strode past towards the waiting jeep, head erect, not looking at the ruined city. Mikhailov had often attended diplomatic receptions before the war, and he felt confident and at ease with Paulus. He was never ever so solicitous, but always cool and respectful. He was sitting beside Paulus, watching his face and waiting for him to break the silence. He had already been present at the preliminary interrogation of the other generals. They had behaved very differently. The Chief of Staff of the Sixth Army had declared in a slow, lazy voice that it was the Italians and Romanians who were to blame for the catastrophe. The hook-nosed Lieutenant General Sixt von Armin, his medals tinkling gloomily, had added, "And it wasn't only Garibaldi and that Eighth Army of his. It was the Russian cold, the lack of supplies and munitions." Schlemmer, a grey-haired commander of the Tank Corps, wearing a Knight's Cross together with a medal he had been awarded for having received 5 wounds, had interrupted this conversation to ask if they would look after his suitcase. After that everyone had begun talking at once. General Rinaldo, a man with a gentle smile who was head of the medical service, Colonel Ludwig, the morose commander of a tank division, whose face had been hideously scarred by a sabre cut, Colonel Adam, Paulus's adjutant, had made the worst fuss of all. He had lost his toilet case, kept throwing his hands up into the air and shaking his head in despair. The flaps of his leopard-skin cap had flapped about like the ears of a pedigreed dog just out of the water. These officers had indeed become human again, but not in the most admirable manner. The driver was wearing a smart white sheepskin coat. Mikhailov told him to drive more slowly. "Certainly, comrade Lieutenant Colonel," he answered quietly. The driver was very much looking forward to telling his comrades about Paulus, to going home at the end of the war and saying, "Now, when I was driving Field Marshal Paulus..." He was also determined to drive outstandingly well, to make Paulus say, "So that's what a Soviet driver's like, a true professional." It was hard for a soldier's eye to take in this spectacle, to get used to seeing Russians and Germans in such close proximity. Cheerful squads of infantrymen were searching through the cellars, climbing down into the mouths of sewers, herding the Germans up to the frozen surface. On patches of wasteland and empty streets, with much prodding and shouting, these infantrymen then reformed the German army, throwing men from quite different arms of the service into the same column. The Germans trudged on, trying not to stumble, looking round now and again at the Russian soldiers and their guns. They were submissive not only because it would be so easy for the Russian soldiers to shoot them, they were submissive because of the hypnotic aura of power that surrounded them. The field marshal was being driven south. The columns of prisoners were being marched in the opposite direction. A powerful loudspeaker was roaring out like a well-known song. "I left yesterday for distant lands. My love waved her handkerchief beside the gate." A wounded prisoner was being carried along by 2 comrades. His pale, dirty arms hung round their necks. The heads of his 2 bearers drew closer together, his deathly pale face and burning eyes between them. Another wounded prisoner was being dragged out of a bunker on a blanket. The snow was dotted with blue-grey stacks of weapons. They were like bricks of steel straw that had just been threshed. A Russian soldier was being lowered into his tomb to salute a gunfire. A few yards away lay heaps of dead Germans who had just been hauled up from the hospital cellars. A crowd of Romanian soldiers went past, guffawing, waving their arms about, making fun of the Germans, both living and dead. Prisoners were being herded along from the nursery, from the Tsaritsa, from the House of Specialists. They walked with a very particular gait, the gait adopted by humans and animals who have lost their freedom. The lightly wounded and frostbitten were leaning on sticks or pieces of charred planks. On they marched. It seemed that all of them had the same greyish face, the same eyes, the same expression of suffering. It was surprising how many of these men were very short, with large noses and low foreheads, with small hair-like mouths and bird-like heads. What a lot of Aryans there were, whose dark skin was covered with freckles, boils and pimples. They were weak, ugly men. None of them seemed to have strong chins, arrogant mouths, blonde hair, clear eyes, or granite chests. How extraordinarily similar they were to the equally weak, ugly, unfortunate men who in the autumn of 1941 had been prodded and beaten by the Germans towards prisoner-of-war camps in the West. Now and then you could hear pistol shots in the cellars and bunkers. The crowds of prisoners, still driving along towards the Volga, understood the meaning of these shots only too well. Lieutenant Colonel Mikhailov continued to glance now and then at the field marshal. Meanwhile the driver studied his face in the mirror. Mikhailov could see a long, thin cheek. The driver could see his forehead, his eyes, and his tight, silent lips. They drove past guns with barrels pointing up at the sky, past tanks painted with swastikas, past trucks whose tarpaulin covers were flapping around in the wind, past armoured troop carriers and self-propelled guns. The iron body, the muscles of the Sixth Army were freezing solid, freezing into the ground. The men themselves were still marching slowly past. It seemed as if at any moment they too might come to a halt, might freeze into stillness. Mikhailov, the driver, and the armed guard were all waiting for Paulus to say something, to call out to someone, or at least to look around. But he remained silent. They had no idea where his eyes were looking or what messages they were bringing him. Was he afraid of being seen by his soldiers? Or was that the very thing he wanted? Suddenly Paulus turned to Mikhailov and asked, "Sagen Sie bitte, was ist es Mazurka?" This unexpected question did not help Mikhailov to understand Paulus's thoughts. In fact, he was wondering anxiously whether or not he'd have soup every day, whether he'd have somewhere warm to sleep, whether he'd be able to obtain tobacco.